To item 5, deputations by appointment. Now we have 4 deputations this morning, all relating to the CCHL letter of expectation matter, which we're considering in public excluded later in this meeting. Now each of those deputations will have 10 minutes. And that's the limited time for the deputation. And because we've got a number of deputations and a full agenda, we will need to stick quite strictly to that 10 minutes this morning. So I would first call Chris Goddard from the Sustainable Terrace Incorporated Society. Chris, thank you for joining us this morning. There's a presentation which has already been provided. And Chris, you have 10 minutes to make your deputation to us today.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Chris Goddard. I'm a Terrace resident and on the board of the Sustainable Terrace Incorporated Society. The objective of this society is to make sure that the terrace community remains vibrant now into the future. Through your recent land purchase, the Christchurch ratepayers, the Christchurch Council, has become a member of the terrace community, and we welcome you to Terrace. The photograph that you can see up front there is the night sky from Terrace, taken from the border of the council-owned property where the proposed airport development will be. We have 3 asks for the committee to consider and, if deemed fit, approve. And they're all about driving a culture of openness where previously we have had a culture of secrecy around the terrace land acquisition. So with the letter of expectation, we humbly request that there is an immediate release of the airport draft business case and the draft plans that go with it. We would request an immediate release of the likely approval paths and the potential timeline. Why do we ask these things? This allows for an informed debate about the proposal with the terrace community. At the moment, the community is without real insight of what's being proposed, whether it's a 24/7 airport, whether it is a freight hub and a tourist hub, whether there is one runway or more than one. So with these things, an informed debate can occur. The last one, made somewhat more timely by the government announcement yesterday about state-owned enterprises being carbon neutral by 2025, is about an option to optimise our airport capacity in the southern region. This optimisation could get the full potential out of Invercargill airports, out of Dunedin, out of Queenstown, and especially out of Christchurch. There are many short and medium impacts to the Christchurch community in driving, even in the short term, domestic and international flights, passengers and freight into Terrace. And interestingly, when you look at the New Zealand government letter of expectation for the Christchurch airport, these themes do come through. The photograph here is of the Clutha Mata'ao, and it is slightly upstream from where the proposed airport's 1 million litre per day water intake and sewage discharge is likely to be. When we think about airports, we can see the downside. It is very difficult sometimes to see the upside. So there are some significant impacts to Christchurch and Terrace for the committee to consider. One myth that I hear repeated often by proponents of the airport and by members of the wider Central Lakes and Central Otago community is, Terrace, it's a great idea, only 100 people are impacted. When you look at the facts, and we pulled the facts from the most recent census, there are 2,391 people near the proposed airport. If we make an assessment of the flight paths, and we make that assessment using community expertise, we have some aviation enthusiasts, some construction expertise in the Terrace community. I counted 10,458 people impacted by the flight paths, and my apologies for those who are eagle-eyed. Lake Hayes should read Lake Hawea in my presentation. Now, the Christchurch Council, the Christchurch ratepayers and the community share the impact of a potential development. As you'll know in the committee, dividends have been suspended from the airport by the public trustee, and that suspension is approximately 2 years, which is between $90 and $100 million of dividends the ratepayers do not see. Standard & Poor's talked very authentically to the airport's financial performance recently. 576 million of unsecured debt, a reported 23 million interest payment, and it was reported in the New Zealand Herald the China Construction Bank has had to provide funding to the airport to keep operations in the near term. There's reduced business activity and tourism from any move of traffic from Christchurch to anywhere, and that includes Terrace. So, from the Terrace community's perspective and from mine, it is very difficult to understand the economic, the environmental, the stewardship and the social benefits that an airport would bring to Christchurch or Terrace. One of the impacts, of course, is food supply. Taken adjacent to your land holdings is one of the many vineyards along the airport perimeter. I think this one is South River. And unburnt jet fuel on takeoff and landing is an unknown impact to health. So this land holding is one of them at risk. In the background is where Peter Jackson filmed Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, Scene 17. The vineyard is called Scene 17. So there is always some very interesting local community knowledge once you've joined the local community and started to explore. So the impacts to both Terrace and community, very clear on the downside. My last point, the market does not need to trump the South Island stewardship that the Christchurch International Airport presents for the South Island. And we don't want to see either of our communities hurt while a number of competing interests argue about various airport options. We know that there is community outrage and impacts to social licence to operate, and some of the speakers today will talk more authentically than I can to those. We know that airports can talk very authentically about their reduction in carbon emissions, but as once was told to me, airports' sole purpose are to attract airlines, and airlines are the gateway drug to carbon. One of the impacts which is personal to the three of us sitting here today representing the community will be a rural community changed forever from a farming community to a heavy industrial community based on the airport proposal. So to date, in all the conversations that the Christchurch Airport leadership have had with the Terrace community, not one of the community can recall or has heard of any direct or indirect local economic or local social benefit from the proposal. We hear benefits for the wider community, we hear benefits for the Christchurch Airport as a corporation. We hear some vague comments about tourism for the good of New Zealand, but local economic and social benefit, there have been none. So releasing the thinking, the plans and the mutual benefits will allow an informed conversation where the myths and the speculation that are through the Central Otago, Queenstown Lakes and Terrace community are replaced with facts. So closing, the last photo here is sunset from the airport or proposed airport precinct over the Clutha towards the Pisa Range. Very beautiful part of the country for those who have not yet been there. Do the committee have any questions?
Thank you. Well, we've got 1 minute and 18 seconds left. Are there any questions? All right. Thank you very much indeed for the deputation and for the information that you've provided in it. You've also certainly made your expectations quite clear through the deputation as well. So thank you very much indeed for the time taken in travelling here and also in presenting to us today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So the next deputation, school strike for Christchurch. I would invite Kiara Foley to the table, please. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. Once again, you've got 10 minutes to make this deputation. Thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora, my name is Kiara Foley,
And I'm Mia Sutherland.
and we're here to represent School Strike for Climate Ōtautahi. Now, I'll be really honest with you. I'm pretty disappointed. And I had a really hard time figuring out what I wanted to say to you today, or rather how I wanted to say it. As a young climate activist, I am told that our movement and our goals are inspiring, and I know many of the councillors here today have said similar things to me and my friends about the movement we are a part of, which is why I find it so hard to be sitting here today trying to have this conversation with you. I remember sitting where I am now almost 2 years ago with Mia, asking you to declare a climate emergency, and I remember the hope and the pride I felt when you did. But declaration of a climate emergency means nothing if you are not willing to act by it. And the planned development of a new airport in Terrace shows me that you are not. We cannot afford to be developing an unsustainable airport that we do not need, especially when this money could be invested in far more sustainable local projects. I am ashamed to live under a council who freely calls climate activists inspiring and then turns around and does something so objectively opposed to our mission. You have the opportunity right now to do real good in the position of power you have, to stand up and speak out for what's right, even if you don't have the direct power to change it, to show that your ideals of climate action are true. This new airport will not be green or sustainable. Not until we achieve low emission aircrafts and building practices should these words even inhabit the same sentence as the word airport. We cannot go back to the same level of travel we had before COVID. It was unsustainable and actively endangering our future. We need to build back better with a climate over profit focus.
The Chief Executive Officer of Christchurch International Airport Limited has said that if this airport were to go ahead, then it would be at the cutting edge of New Zealand's drive towards a lower carbon future. However, we do not need these pledges and promises for a low carbon airport when we have the abilities, especially in a domestic setting, to reform the way we think about tourism and transport, which would make a far bigger difference in the long run. We should take advantage of existing larger airports and invest in more sustainable infrastructure for them and their surrounding cities like Ōtautahi. Encourage tourists to travel and experience more of Aotearoa on their way to popular destinations like Queenstown, rather than depriving many other places of tourists by funneling directly into hubs. Both of these things would overall be more beneficial for our climate and country. We value Central Otago because of its stunning landscapes, unique flora and fauna, and beauty. Building an airport here will only destroy the very reason it is being built. If the Council truly values their declaration of a climate emergency in 2019, they will not endorse this idea and the destruction it will do to our planet. This airport is essentially a short-term investment. It will do more harm than good. Why are you investing in this when you could be making groundbreaking change in new domestic travel options, especially given how much time we have to adapt for tourists? I urge you to rethink the way you perceive travel, especially in our current climate, technologically, atmospherically, and globally, and not invest in a new airport. This does not make sense given your declaration of a climate emergency. Prove that this was not simply performative. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Melanie.
Thanks for the deputation. I, agree with your sentiment. My question, I guess, is: do you know that we were as surprised as the public when we found out about this? Because the companies are at arm's length from councillors, so we found out just before it went into the news, just like everybody else.
But you do have the power to support this in your letter of endorsement.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just so that you know that we weren't behind it in the beginning.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for the deputation. Some points very well made. Thanks very much indeed for taking the time to come along and address us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So next, I would invite David Goldsmith from Extinction Rebellion Otatahi to the table. David, good morning. Thank you for joining us. As with the previous deputations, you have 10 minutes to address us this morning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for giving us the time to speak. I'm David Goldsmith and I'm speaking today on behalf of Extinction Rebellion Otatahi. This presentation is a brief overview of our perspective on Taurus Airport. We urge you to be explicit in your letter of expectation to CCHL, which you are voting on today. Please instruct Christchurch International Airport Limited that they must not expand or build new airports when we are living in a climate and ecological crisis. Firstly, the big picture. We are desperately worried about the future for our children and our grandchildren, and for all life on planet Earth. We are living in a human-caused mass extinction event. Please don't believe that humanity can cleverly be immune from extinction. Our lives are part of an interdependent web of life. Even if humanity can avoid extinction, immense death, suffering and chaos is ahead of all 8 billion of us, which the Earth will no longer support after catastrophic climate change, acidified ocean, and general ecological collapse, alongside inevitable war and conflict. Obviously, you already understand and agree that the situation we face is serious and desperate because you declared a climate and ecological emergency 18 months ago. Thank you very much for taking this first step, declaring the truth. We are in an emergency situation. The crisis feels overwhelming, beyond our capacity to acknowledge truly and respond to. However, there are some big picture truths that can guide our sense of direction. Greta Thunberg said, "Our house is on fire." I would add, "and our children are inside." The fire is fueled by coal, oil and gas. We must turn off the tap to have any chance of saving our children. Fossil fuel takes ancient carbon safely stored underground and adds it to the carbon cycle. It is an inconvenient truth that we must end fossil fuel use to save our future. My second big picture truth is the dramatic surge in growth from the 1950s and continuing today across a large range of measures of human activity. This is called the Great Acceleration and includes dramatic growth of emissions, fossil fuel use, and international travel and tourism. A sobering fact is our climate heating emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution have more than doubled globally since 1990. In just 30 years, emissions are more than the previous 200 years. Now consider the decade's lag between emissions and their full climate effect, and the Great Acceleration is terrifying. My third big picture is described in the recent Oxfam report, Confronting Carbon Inequality. The world's wealthiest 1% emit double the carbon pollution of the poorest 50%. Since 1990, the richest 1% are responsible for 15% of emissions, leaving the poorest half of humanity only emitting 7%. Also, more than a third of emissions come from the richest 5%, and more than half of emissions from the richest 10%. The wealthiest 10% are what we would regard as an average income. The wealthiest 10% are also responsible for 75% of energy use linked to aviation. We are witness to astonishing and growing inequality in both consumption and emissions. There is also chilling Intergenerational inequality. It is our children who will be paying the price for our present excess and inadequate response. Current responses to the climate and ecological emergency fall dramatically short of the problem. Our COVID response worked because political leadership was based on science and there was the public goodwill to act. COVID was an acute emergency and we responded urgently. The eco-crisis is a chronic emergency we have been well aware of since before the 1990s, but we have delayed any adequate response. The COVID emergency has shown that it is possible to swiftly take unprecedented actions. We are out of excuses for our woeful inaction on the eco-crisis. We are all in this together. If our response is inadequate, yet all of us are doing our utmost, then at least we could feel we're all in this together. But that isn't what is happening. Instead, we have Christchurch International Airport using sustainability greenwashing to justify plans to build a whole new airport at Terrace. Sustainability is peppered everywhere in their corporate propaganda. The Terrace proposal is described as a world-class sustainable airport. There may be electricity to plug into planes on the tarmac, and maybe electric trolleys to carry luggage, but there is no escaping that building a new airport is yet another step in the great acceleration. Quite apart from the emissions from construction, a new airport is another leap in emissions from the increased flight capacity and the associated expansion in tourism. It is like some of us are trying to run north to a truly sustainable future, but all the while we are all together on a speeding train heading south straight to oblivion. At this point, I don't know whether I should be raging or weeping. Those stoking the train accelerating south are justifying their actions using sustainability branding. Sustainability is not a brand. Sustainability is our children having a future or not having a future. We could be here arguing for the shutdown of international tourism altogether as part of an adequate response to this crisis. Clearly, tourism is a luxury activity. However, we are not here to argue that. We are here for a ridiculously low-hanging fruit, the building of a whole new airport. Building a new airport is part of the crazy, criminal, great acceleration of emissions being proposed by Christchurch International Airport Limited. We are not interested in your normal conventions of being non-specific in your letter of expectation, or arm's-length governance arrangements, or electric aeroplanes being used to justify a dishonest corporate sustainability brand. There is no escaping that Christchurch City Council is 75% owned by there's no escaping that Christchurch City Council is 75% owner of Christchurch International Airport Limited. There's no escaping that 4 of you are directors in the holding company for that 75% ownership. And there is no escaping that we are in a desperate climate and eco-crisis that threatens our very existence. Now is the time for courage and truly facing this crisis together. Fossil fuels must end completely. We, the globally privileged, need to dramatically reduce our consumption and emissions. And the horror that I've politely called intergenerational inequality is actually us accelerating straight towards an atrocity that exceeds any previous atrocity in human history. We don't even have the words in English to adequately describe it. We have genocide and the more recently coined ecocide, but what word do you use for causing global mass extinction, possibly including ourselves? Anilicide? This crisis requires our courage, our clarity, and all of us genuinely together. Actually, it is asking for a team of 8 billion, so let's start here now. This is beyond distinctions like politician or activist. Those of us who are activists need to be sensitive to political dynamics, and you who are politicians need to combine your politics with activism for genuine, urgent change. We are out of time. Those of you who are directors of CCHL, if standing up for our children's future means risking some of your personal future, then so be it. Please have that courage. The numbers dying during my presentation here have been growing, representing the many who are already dying and those who will die. Climate change and mass extinction is a slow-burning, unprecedented crisis. To promote building a new airport in the name of sustainability is criminal and future generations will clearly see its criminality. We are Extinction Rebellion. We are in rebellion against business as usual. We are in non-violent rebellion against criminal, corporate, sustainability greenwashing. Over our dead bodies will Terrace Airport go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed for the deputation and for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we move to our fourth and final deputation of the morning. I would call Chris Horn to the table. Chris, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
Thank you. Oh. Kia ora koutou. Nice to see you all.
So as with the previous deputations, you've got 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I hope to be quicker than that. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here today. And I thought I might start with a little bit of, gratitude and thanks, because sometimes that's missing. So I'd just like to say I'm deeply grateful that the New Zealand government has now declared a climate emergency, and that we're a signatory on the Paris Agreement, and also that the CCC last year declared a climate and ecological emergency. So thank you for that, and I guess that's quite an important context. I also note that one of the City Council's strategic priorities is meeting the challenge of climate change through every means possible. And that as a CCTO, Christchurch International Airport has what looks like a sincere commitment to the idea of sustainability. They've clearly been doing some fantastic work on their own environmental footprint. So those are all good things. I also want to point out that we live in a highly complex and interconnected world, which has a few implications. And one of those is that black and white simplicities about what is right and wrong are always going to be at least partially wrong. There may be some positive aspects to this airport, and there might be some things that are beneficial in the long term. However, I would also say that while that might be possible, the way things look at the moment, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. And to add to this, since 1990, New Zealand had the second highest growth in emissions of all the developed countries in the world. And that's pretty bad, and Christchurch is one of the worst cities in New Zealand. So, we're not sitting on anything that we can call a good reputation here. We need to be really looking at ourselves carefully. And I guess the other aspect of this I find a little distressing is that international flights do not appear on our carbon emissions books. And that's part of an outdated agreement that was signed in 1944 that actually means that airlines don't pay tax on their fuel tax, and that international flights are not claimed by any country. So there's a whole lot of emissions going on that are not counted in the world's overall carbon emissions. And, we're a long way from places, so our carbon emissions are much higher than they look, even though they're already bad. And I'd also say that airports, no matter how wonderful their sustainability policies, do not and cannot stand alone. They need airlines, and airlines need them. More airports open doors to more flights, to more tourists, to more road use, to more public expenditure on road and rail and on destination infrastructure and so on. And I wonder where the overall development plan for a piece of infrastructure this big is. How does it look in the context of that area, and how are the communications with the organisations that work in those areas? There doesn't seem to be any communication. They're as surprised as you were at what happened. So I'm kind of thinking this looks like a competitive move to me, and in a world where there's a lot of interconnections, competition, and we're in a crisis, competition isn't going to cut it. We're not going to achieve any kind of change if everybody thinks it's still a good idea to compete, especially on big pieces of infrastructure where we actually need people to collaborate far better. If Queenstown Airport were to close, for example, if Wanaka Airport were to close, if and with apologies to the terrace community because there's a whole lot of issues there. Maybe that would solve some of the issues. If electric planes existed, that might help as well. I mean, we've got little ones, but what are the chances of big ones? That's actually up for question. Legally, and we've been talking to lawyers to think this through as well, as a CCTO, the principal objective of Christchurch International Airport includes exhibit a sense of social and environmental responsibility by having regards to the interests of the community, and I know they really need to be thinking about communities at this point, in which it operates, and by endeavouring to accommodate or encourage these when able to do so. A CCTO must also achieve objectives in its statement of intent, including ensure the company adopts an environmentally sustainable approach to the operation of the business. And, you know, we can see them trying, but it includes things like land use, water, energy, waste, and noise management. And I guess increasingly it's going to include things like carbon emissions. So those things are part of the Local Government Act and the Statement of Intent. And yet, you know, developing a new airport doesn't seem like a really good way to achieve those things. In particular, in its decision making as a matter of law, the 2050 target in the Climate Change Response Act should be considered in all decision making on the proposed airport as well. So that's a new thing that's been a relatively recent thing that's come in. The Council's commitment to reducing emissions makes the 2050 target relevant to decision making on the Terrace Airport, as well as the airport's objectives as set out in the LGA and its own statement of intent, such as it would be an error of law not to take that into account, according to one of the lawyers we've spoken to. So there are issues. You know, the RMA is going to change too, so we need to be thinking ahead about that. In addition to that, there have been some very successful challenges to the development of new airports overseas and to the extension of airports overseas. So this is becoming a thing that's happening reasonably well, and airports haven't been able to extend or to be built most recently. I would hope that's going to be the same in New Zealand. So, the other thing is I do wonder how they're feeling down in the Queenstown Lakes area. Certainly the people I've talked to down there, because I used to live in that area, aren't feeling particularly happy about Christchurch City, a Christchurch City-owned enterprise coming in and overriding their own airport, or at least competing with it. So there's some interesting stuff going on down there. It doesn't seem like a really good way to build relationships and the sorts of relationships that we need to be building if we're actually going to be meeting the climate change emergency, or the climate emergency. So relationships are critical to successful change, and in this I'm just going to step back a little bit. When I stand back and look at the idea of meeting the challenge of climate change through every means possible, I see a hugely complex task. You know, fossil fuels are in everything we do, and our ways of life have to change, our communities have to change, our transport has to change, a whole lot of stuff has to change, and that's going to be really hard. And you're not going to do it in a world that is all about competition. The only way I've ever seen change happen, and I've seen quite a lot of it happen, is where there's high levels of trust, where there are relationships where people are all working to the same goal, where people are looking out for each other and meeting complex situations with their own complexity. So, you know, with their own emotions, with their own feelings, with their own knowledge. It's not just about analysis and competition. And in fact, I think those things are going to get in the way. So I would say, yes, please change or make sure that your letter of expectation to the Christchurch International Airport includes some of these things. And I guess I've been a little bit disconcerted by this arm's length thing and how that makes it really hard to find out what's going on and how transparent things are not. And I also would question, you know, who's benefiting from that and who's not, and who's paying, if you like, because as somebody on the community side of things, it's made it very hard for me and for us to actually find out what's happening. So I think the rules and the processes that you have around the arm's length may help the relationship between council and business, but they're actually creating a really significant layer of distrust between those two sectors in your communities. And that's quite a bind, because you need the rules and guidelines to manage the relationship with business. I get that, but you also need a way of helping those relationships with the communities that you're affecting here. No simple way to fix that. I don't think it's an easy task, but it's kind of a little microcosm of the sort of issues that we're going to face as we work through making changes that we need in order to meet the climate crisis. Without the trust of your communities, any significant change is very likely to end badly. And that's where I'll finish. Thanks very much.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to come and address us this morning. And thanks to everybody who has come along and made these deputations, for sharing your views and raising these issues with us today. The letter of expectation for CCHL, which has been referred to, will be considered later in today's meeting. But thank you to all of you for coming along and sharing your views with us this morning. Thank you.